everyone, yes, it is me yet again, and I am back with case number 4. I have another unsolved true crime case for you guys today. This is a very interesting case that I have in store for you all, and it was actually a really difficult and frustrating to do research on this one due to, first of all, the lack of information on the victim. You guys know I love getting to know the victim when I do research a case. I always think it's important for us to remember the victim, who they were, what type of personality they had, what they loved to do while they were alive. But for this case, we unfortunately won't get a lot of that. Second, it was incredibly frustrating with how much misinformation or how many different versions of events that have been released about this case. And there are a lot of holes and contradictory statements from the witnesses, and overall this case is just a big mess. But bear with me, because regardless of how little information is on this case, it is still very important and her story deserves to be told, and I am going to share her story to the best of my ability. Please don't forget to like, share, subscribe. I would love to have the support for my videos and for what I do because it is very important to me. But as always, I will now show my disclaimer. Her murder is very graphic and very unexplainable at the end of the day, but let's go ahead and get into today's case, which is the case of Karina Holmer. Karina Holmer was born in 1976, and she was born in a very small town in Sweden. She grew up with both of her parents and with her sister Joanna. Not a lot is honestly known about her childhood, but she is generally described as vibrant, social, outgoing. According to her family members, from a very young age, Karina had always dreamed of traveling. She wanted to travel the world. That is just something she had always wanted to do. And she always said that she was going to travel as soon as she became old enough to be able to do so. She is also described as intelligent. She received good grades in school. And overall, it seemed like Karina had a very likable personality, as it was very easy for her to make friends wherever she was. And on top of her likable personality, she was clearly also a very beautiful young woman with her long blonde hair and pale complexion. Because of these traits, she was described as being the complete package, so to speak. When she became a young adult, in her free time, she would love to go out in clubs and to bars, dancing and drinking with her friends, and she ended up doing this quite often. Then in either late 1995 or early 1996, it's not clear on what year or exactly when, but when Karina was still 19 years old, she had won a little bit of money from a Sweden scratch-off ticket, and the amount she won, it equates to about $1,500 US. She used this money to travel to the United States, and like I said, there will be a lot of conflicting information as I go on for this case. And I will be very clear on what's conflicting and what part is not. So this part is conflicting. Some sources state that she used the money and went through an actual au pair agency through the United States government, and she got assigned to a family that way. Or other sources state that she used the money to buy a plane ticket to the United States. That's when she started searching for an au pair position, and she had found one that way. Again, not clear on how exactly she got this au pair position, but regardless, she did. And by the way, if you don't know what an au pair is, it's basically like a nanny. They are foreigners who travel from their country, and in exchange for childcare services and housework services, they get to live with these families abroad. And this is exactly what Karina Holmer did. She became an au pair to a family and relocated from her country of Sweden to the United States, and specifically she got to Dover, Massachusetts. The family that she was an au pair for, their names were Frank Rapp and Susan Nitcher, and they were a pretty well-off, successful married couple. Frank was a photographer and Susan was a painter. They had 2 small children, a son who was in the 1st grade and a daughter who was a toddler at the time. Frank actually had his own workspace. He used a loft studio for his photography, and his loft was located in the southern part of Boston. He would stay at this loft during the weekdays, Monday through Friday. And during Monday through Friday, it was Karina's job to take care of the children and complete the housework while both of the parents worked their respective jobs. When Frank would come home on the weekends to the family's condo in Dover, and the drive from Dover to Boston is about a 45-minute drive. So Karina was allowed, and she took advantage of this. Frank would allow her to use the loft on the weekends. Karina enjoyed going out to the clubs and to the bars on the weekends. The loft was actually considered like the meeting point for Karina and all of her friends to meet up. And in 1996, there were a lot of au pair nannies around this area at this time. Karina had managed to meet several other nannies and became good friends with a bunch of them, and they would all get together, meet up at Frank's loft and get ready and then enjoy their weekends going out to various clubs and dance and drink and have fun. Karina was underage at the time, and so were a lot of these au pair nannies. She was 20 years old, and she used a fake ID in order to gain access to these nightclubs, and it didn't seem like she was ever, if at any point, turned away. She could have been, I'm not sure, but it seemed like she gained access fairly easy. It is very much depicted that she loved the nightlife of Boston, partying with the other au pairs. She would go out and do this pretty much every weekend while she was in the States. So that does take us to the night of June 21st, 1996. The timeline here, it's incredibly difficult from this point on, but we're going to go ahead and do the best that we can with the information that's provided. So it was a Friday night. Karina was spending it in her usual, typical way. She traveled to Boston, to Frank's loft. She met up with a few of her au pair friends. They got ready, got dressed, put on makeup, and they went to one of their favorite places to drink and to dance. This place is called the Zanzibar Club. And at the time, this club was a pretty popular night spot in Boston. It was located in the Theater District, so very popular area. And during this night, Karina seemed to be having a good time. She was talking to people, dancing, singing. She did begin to drink, and she drank throughout this night. Several witnesses that night have reported that Karina had become heavily intoxicated with her alcohol consumption that night. There are different accounts. Some say that Karina had passed out in the bathroom or at one of the tables at one point during the night. Some people said that she began singing incoherently, displaying very intoxicated behavior, stumbling, slurring her words. It just seemed like she did get pretty smashed during that night. Apparently, Karina's friends, at some point during the night, they did end up leaving her. She had arrived with 3 or 4 other people, and they all just ended up leaving. And it's not clear why they left. Some articles state that some of the friends left with men, or they did leave and go to a different nightclub or bar. And which, by the way, I hate referring to those people that left her that night as her friends, because I don't know about you guys, but no one that I would call a friend would ever leave me alone at a club, especially if I'm so obviously heavily intoxicated. If you arrive with a group of people, then you should leave with that same group of people, especially if you're planning on drinking, you're planning on, partying, and it's fine to do that. There's nothing wrong with doing that. But if you come with people, then leave with those people. It's just common sense. That's how a lot of these shitty situations happen, is when a group leaves one person behind at a place and this person happens to be drunk, and that's how people end up going missing, and Karina's case being murdered because of people leaving each other. And it really pisses me off because it happens time and time again with these cases, and it seems like no one ever learns to stay together. I mean, I'm not saying you guys need to be attached at the hip. I'm not saying no one can meet a guy and leave. I mean, that's fine, but there needs to be some sort of communication. Just give each other the courtesy of letting them know that, hey, I met this guy, I'm going to go with him, or just anything to make sure that your friend is safe. But anyway, at this point, Karina is alone at this club. She doesn't have her friends with her anymore. And here's where more conflicting information comes in. At some point, Karina does leave the Zanzibar Club. And some sources say that Karina left on her own free will. She just walked out. Other articles say that a bouncer had to escort her out of the bar because of how intoxicated she had become at this point. And then we have other sources that say that they saw Karina get into a car with a couple of men, and then she got out of the car and then began walking the streets. It's very conflicting information here because of these people saying different things that happened right when she left the bar. But regardless, she did leave the bar, A lot of people do report seeing her walking the streets, dancing and singing, clearly intoxicated, but seeming to be okay. And at this point, it's around probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, very early Saturday morning. A lot of people do see her stumbling through alleyways and whatnot. And towards the end of the night, she met up with a local man and his dog. And they were pretty well known around the area because him and the dog were wearing matching Superman shirts. Multiple people saw Karina talking with this man. And there is footage that also confirmed that she was talking with this man. And this man's name was Herb Witten. So in 1996, there weren't a lot of cameras around the area at this point. The little footage that was caught was really Karina just leaving the Zanzibar club and then the few minutes of her talking to Herb. And we will come back to Herb later on, so go ahead and remember Herb. After her conversation with Herb, and so it's believed around 3:30 or 4 a.m., there's really no sighting of Karina after this. That's pretty much the last time anyone sees Karina alive. It is unclear at what time in the morning she was murdered. There are speculations that it could have been 5 o'clock in the morning. It could have been later on around 7 or 8. It's sadly unclear. So on Sunday morning, June 23rd, 1996, a homeless man was rummaging through garbage cans and dumpsters. And while he was opening trash bags, assumingly to find either bottles or cans or other recyclables, he actually made a gruesome discovery. When he opened a trash bag in a dumpster, and immediately when he opened it, he discovered a human arm sticking out. He wasted no time. He calls the police after seeing this, and the police come. They search this entire dumpster, and they of course search the trash bag this homeless man opened. And in this trash bag, they find the top half of Karina Holmer, and only the top half of her body. What I will describe next is graphic, so if you don't want to hear about any further details of Karina's body, the state it was in, or autopsy report information, you can go ahead and skip a couple of minutes from here. Karina Holmer's body had been severed by a saw, and the sawing occurred right under the ribs. So whatever saw was used on her, it only really had to cut through one bone, which of course is the spine. Her cause of death officially is strangulation, as she had severe rope marks around her throat. Obviously, Karina was wearing makeup the night she left for the Zanzibar club, but the makeup she was wearing had been washed off of her face. And what's kind of interesting, in my opinion, is that in this dumpster and in this trash bag, there is very little blood that police found. Almost really no blood at all, actually, which I think is very interesting because she, again, was severed in half. So it's very widely believed, and according to sources, the top half of her body had been completely washed, it seemed, before being put inside a garbage bag. There's also reports that her wrists also had red markings around them, suggesting that she had also been tied up at some point. But other than that, there isn't any reportings of her having any other defensive wounds. There was no scratches, there was no bruises. They did swab the inside of her mouth and underneath her fingernails, but no evidence or DNA was recovered from these swabs. And like I said, only the top half of her body was ever found. The lower half was never located. No one knows what happened to the lower portion of her body. There are, of course, speculations of what happened to that lower half, but whether Karina was sexually assaulted or not is impossible to confirm because they did not have that lower portion. The only other evidence that was really found was in the trash bag that kept Karina's top half of her body. There was a partial fingerprint. And of course, this partial fingerprint has not led to any leads or suspects and has never been matched to anybody. Karina's cell phone and purse that she had with her that Friday night was also never recovered. So we have no idea what happened to those items as well. Shortly after the portion of Karina's body was discovered, the news reported that a young woman with blonde hair had been found in a dumpster. And it was reported that same Sunday. And apparently Susan and Frank saw this on the news, and they had apparently been concerned because they had not heard from Karina and she was supposed to have been back by now. So they were concerned, and when they heard about a young blonde woman being found, they did contact the police, and that is how the identity of Karina had been confirmed. What made the investigation for police extremely difficult was the fact that they didn't have a crime scene. Karina wasn't murdered directly inside of this dumpster or inside this trash bag. She was placed there. And to this day, they have never been able to locate the place where Karina had been murdered. So as you can imagine, this made investigating the murder so much more difficult, since not a lot of evidence was ever found. Just really that partial fingerprint was the best piece of evidence they were able to find. And on top of not having a crime scene, all the contradictory statements from pretty much all of the witnesses from that night that were interviewed were just so completely unhelpful to the police. Because of all of these statements and how one person said one thing and then another person said another thing, the police were unable to get a clear timeline or really even concrete information on Karina's movements that night. The portion of Karina's body that was found was eventually flown back to her home in Sweden, and her funeral was held in her home country. The police began their investigation, and they questioned, of course, Karina's friends and family. This part is pretty interesting. Apparently, Karina frequently sent letters home, and she would frequently write to her friends and to her family. One friend that Karina wrote to, and this was just a couple of weeks before Karina was murdered. In this letter, Karina stated that something terrible had happened. She didn't go into any further detail. She just stated that something terrible had happened and that she would explain more of that situation when she returned back home. And her saying that is really eerie to me because I am so curious of what she meant by that. I mean, did she mean that something terrible happened to her or just something terrible in general happened? It's really interesting to think about what she meant by that. When this letter came forward, they ended up talking to Karina's sister Joanna, because Karina would also frequently write to her sister. And Joanna said that from her last couple of letters from Karina never told her that something bad had happened or anything. But she did tell Joanna that her being in the United States wasn't really working out. It wasn't what she expected it to be. She apparently wasn't enjoying it like she thought she would. And she did tell Joanna that she would most likely be coming home sooner than she originally had planned. But I do think the letters are very interesting. It does tell us a lot that something was going on with Karina. I mean, if she wanted to come home early and something bad had happened, maybe something bigger was going on at that time. So let's go ahead and talk about some of the potential theories and suspects of this case. So let's go ahead and start with going back to Herb Whitten. So of course, him being probably one of the last people to ever speak to Karina while she was alive, police found him fairly easily. Again, he was a well-known person around the area. They recognized him when they saw the footage. They knew exactly who he was. He was questioned, and Herb just said, yeah, he did, of course, talk to Karina, but it was just a short conversation, and after the conversation, they just both went their separate ways, and he said he had nothing to do with what happened to her. And police actually ruled him out pretty quickly because apparently that same night, he had been speeding and he was pulled over and he did receive a ticket for speeding. So this is really what ruled him out in police's eyes due to this ticket. This actually places him out of the area where Karina was, and overall it doesn't fit in police's minds the timeline of events that they had come up with of what happened that night. But again, this timeline is just so wishy-washy because of all the conflicting statements from everybody. So I'm honestly not entirely sure how they were, with 100% certainty, able to rule him out based on this ticket. But regardless, they did rule him out. But what I did find interesting, and it could seem suspicious, I'm not gonna lie, Herb Whitten actually ended up ending his own life about a little over a year after Karina's murder. And of course, some people speculate that he killed himself because he was just so guilty of murdering Karina and he couldn't live with himself any longer, so he felt that he had to end his own life. I say it's possible, of course. I mean, for this case, we can't honestly rule out anything. But we don't know a lot about Herb. All we know about him is that he liked to walk his dog. They wore matching Superman outfits. He talked to Karina that night, and he was pulled over, and he did receive a ticket for speeding. He was questioned and cleared, and then a year later, he took his own life. That's literally all we know about this man. He could have been suffering from mental illness his entire life. He could have had a whole bunch of other shit going on. We don't know. There's just so little information about him. I mean, we honestly just don't know. So by far the most popular speculation or theories of who murdered Karina is actually the couple that she worked for, Frank and Susan. Of course, once Karina was officially identified, both of them were questioned about Karina, who she was, and how she acted the last couple of weeks of her life. Frank and Susan both didn't seem to give a lot of information in general about Karina. All they basically were able to say was that she had been their au pair for the last several weeks, and that she did take care of their children and did housework while they worked their jobs. And police did ask them about the letters Karina had sent to her sister and her friend, and they asked if they had noticed her being unhappy with them, or if they knew that she was planning on leaving back to Sweden earlier than they expected. And they just didn't know anything about that. They said they had no idea. They thought Karina was very happy. They didn't notice anything strange, and they definitely didn't know that she was planning on going back home sooner than expected. The incident that I do believe makes them highly suspicious for this case is that on Monday, June 24th, so one day after Karina had been found, the police had been called to Frank and Susan's condo in Dover, and they were called in because one of the dumpsters at their property had been set on fire. And just think about that for a second. Just one day after their au pair is found viciously murdered, their dumpster just conveniently sets on fire. To me, that's either an extremely red flag or a very convenient coincidence. I mean, if you think about it, potentially, allegedly, there could have been evidence in this dumpster, right? Karina was found in a dumpster, and police obviously thought that it was incredibly odd as well. So they did gather the remaining ashes from the dumpster after the fire was put out, and they did test it for human remains and tested it for any other evidence, but unfortunately nothing came up with these ashes. And it's also good to note that Frank and Susan really didn't have a solid alibi during the night of June 21st. No one could confirm where they were at. They both apparently claimed that they were home with their children that night. So I think that's also worth noting. But nothing concrete has ever tied them to the crime. Many people believe that mainly Frank Rapp could have been the perpetrator of this case, because of course rumors began to fly when people are trying to come up with an explanation for things. Everyone of course wanted to know what happened to Karina. Of course the rumor mill began to fly. So based on the letter from her friend stating that something terrible had happened, people began to come up with these ideas about Frank, that maybe Frank had sexually assaulted Karina, and that's the terrible incident that occurred, and that's what she was talking about to her friend in that letter. And then, of course, the rumors began to snowball. Since Frank had his loft, maybe he would use it to sexually assault Karina from time to time. Or maybe on the flip side of that, maybe it was some sort of a consensual relationship, and that could have been a motive for Frank to want to murder Karina, because maybe him and Karina were having this affair, and maybe Karina was threatening to tell Susan about it. Some have even gone as far to speculate that maybe Karina had gotten pregnant by Frank too. And then maybe that was the reason why her body had been sawed in half, and why her lower half of her body had never been found. And that lower half was destroyed in order to destroy that evidence that she had been pregnant. But again, these are all just theories and speculations that people have come up with. Police have never found any evidence that supports any of these theories whatsoever. And to me, these theories of Frank or Susan being involved could be a little bit far-fetched, because the main question is, if Frank or Susan, if either had anything to do with Karina's murder, then why did they wait to commit the murder when she was out in Boston? Why didn't they just get rid of her when it was more convenient when she was in their condo in Dover? It just seems a little bit odd that they would wait for her to be in that area in Boston, for her to go to these clubs to get intoxicated, and then they somehow were able to find her roaming the streets. It's just a little hard to believe when you think about it, honestly. But I do keep coming back to that dumpster fire, because that is without a doubt just so shady that it just happened one day after. That's what really bugs me. So obviously this case was so beyond frustrating because of all the misinformation. It quite frankly got very annoying because one article would say one thing, then another article would say something completely different. And so since researching this information had been so difficult for me, I can't even imagine what a pain in the ass it is to be an actual investigator for this case. Karina's murderer is still out there. And it's awful and it's tragic. She was a 20-year-old young woman. She barely got to experience life. Just when she started to travel and conquer that dream of hers that she's had since she was a little girl, her life was just cut short in a very brutal and terrible way. It's just so awful that she has yet to get justice for what was done to her. The witnesses from that night have just been completely useless in my opinion. I don't understand how out of the several people that witnessed Karina that night, how almost all of them had a different version of a story to tell. It's absolutely ridiculous. And of course, we all know that eyewitnesses aren't the greatest source of information in the world. We all know this in the true crime community. We know. But why is it that every person seemed to have something different to say and something different to tell about that night? Was everybody in the area that witnessed Karina just completely intoxicated as well, and that's why no one could give a straight story or at least a decent timeline for Karina? I just don't know, and it really irritates me, to be honest. I feel like someone should have obviously seen something that night. It was a Friday night in Boston. There were so many people either heading home or heading to other nightclubs or bars. Someone should have seen something, but yet here we are 26 years later with still no answers. No leads, no new suspects. No one has ever been arrested for Karina's murder, and there's just nothing to go off of at this point. Karina's case is open, but it is a cold case. And as time goes on, it's just going to be more and more difficult. This has been a very interesting case all around, and all we can really do is hope that one day Karina Holmer and her family and loved ones get the answers and the justice that they all deserve. But unfortunately, that is really all the information we have for case number 4. Thank you so much for sticking with me to the end. I know this was a very frustrating one. I know I'm just completely infuriated by it. If you want to continue to support me and the true crime journey, please don't hesitate. Click that subscribe button and the notifications bell. Give a thumbs up to this video. Share it if you would like to your friends. And if anyone has a specific case they would like me to cover, please leave a comment below. It can be a solved case, an unsolved case, a past missing persons case, a current missing persons case, anything I am very open to. I really do love researching all cases, so I would love to hear anyone's and everyone's recommendations. But that is really all I have for you guys today, and I will catch you guys later in case number 5. Bye.